There we are. It's my great pleasure to welcome Cheryl Misak to Senior College. Most of you are likely to have some knowledge of Cheryl, but few are likely to have a sense of the full range of her talents and achievements. After receiving her DPhil from Oxford and spending a brief time on the faculty at Queen's, Cheryl joined the philosophy department at Toronto, where she is now university professor. Her teaching areas include bioethics, ethics, the history of analytic philosophy, pragmatism, and social and political philosophy. She's produced 6 books, edited an additional 5, and published dozens of articles. Her 3 most recent books, all from Oxford University Press, are The American Pragmatists, 2013, Cambridge Pragmatism from Peirce and James to Ramsey and Wittgenstein, 2016, and Frank Ramsey, A Sheer Excess of Powers, 2020. Her many awards and honors include a Rhodes Scholarship, a Humboldt Fellowship, a Guggenheim, fellowships at St. John's and Trinity Colleges, Cambridge, and an honorary fellowship at Balliol College, Oxford. Her administrative service reveals a similar broad range. She's been chair of philosophy, acting director of the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology, dean and acting principal of UTM, and vice president and provost of the university. The latter is, in my view, the most difficult job in the university. And yet she was able to write her magisterial book on American pragmatism while she was in the provost's office. Perhaps she thought she had done with administration, but she's again been nabbed, this time as interim director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. We'll be hearing about Frank Ramsey. Her book, 2020 book, was reviewed very, very positively in many places. The one that stuck in my mind was the New Yorker review, and most impressively was selected by Tom Stoppard as Book of the Year for 2020. Cheryl, over to you.
Thanks, Brian, for that extremely generous introduction. So as Brian has indicated, I'm going to talk about Frank Ramsey and about writing this biography, because it was extremely interesting to undertake this project, and in fact still is. Just before we started, I was chatting with some people here saying that I'm right now writing a paper with a bunch of medics, trying to really dig deeper into how Frank Ramsey died, because one of these medics used her considerable influence and managed to get his 1930 case notes from Guy's Hospital, London, his like confidential patient bedside notes. And so we're doing a deep dive into causes of his death. So I'm going to talk about this remarkable one-man interdisciplinary department, and also, as I say, about writing this biography. As you can see, Ramsey's dates are not very impressive in terms of length. He died at the age of 26 in January 1930. And I'm going to start with a bit of an academic's fairy tale. So when I write, I start writing a draft right away. And in a very early draft of the introduction, I had a line that said, it's a terrible shame that no one wrote a biography of Frank Ramsey when there were still people alive who knew him. So a lot of us, even people my age, we knew people like Richard Braithwaite, who was Ramsey's friend. And certainly, there was lots of opportunities in the decades after Ramsey's death for someone to write a biography of him. No one did, and so I bemoaned the fact that we just didn't have access to a lot of first-hand accounts of him. And then in what can only be described as an academic's fairy tale, I was in the Max Newman papers at St. John's College, Cambridge. Celia Letton, Newman was a great friend of Ramsey's. Newman was with Alan Turing, one of the top 2 code breakers at Bletchley. And I see a letter to Max Newman from one Laurie Levitt Kahn. And she said, "Dear Professor Newman, I'm a DPhil student at Oxford, and for my thesis, I'm writing a biography of Frank Ramsey, the great Cambridge mathematician, philosopher, and economist. I know you knew him well. Might I come interview you? I have a motor car." And there was a reply from Newman saying, "Sure," and that's it. And I Googled Laurie Levitt, no trace at all of her. And I actually on Christmas Eve, I emailed the head of New College Oxford. She wrote on New College letterhead to Newman, and I asked if there's any way of tracing this person who had been a DPhil student. Christmas Day, he goes, the fellow in charge of alumni goes in and he finds her. Married, divorced, changed her name, and now I'm in touch with Laurie Kahn, and she's on the phone to her, and she's telling me about the 50 hours of taped interviews that she had, about how she wrote to all of Ramsey's classmates and got replies, because she was trying to write this biography in the early 1980s when there were still lots of people alive who had known him. And I'm in a flap of excitement in my kitchen. And then she says, "But there's a problem." And then she said a very famous biographer had asked to borrow her Ramsey materials a decade ago, and this biographer would not return them. So then I was in a pitched battle with this very famous biographer, and eventually this person dumped all of her Ramsey materials in a couple of boxes and sent them through UPS, and now they exist. They're lodged in the Fisher Rare Book Library as the Laurie Kahn Ramsey collection. And this is a long way of saying that you're going to hear some clips as I go through from those tapes that Laurie Kahn recorded so long ago. The subtitle of the biography I take from the great Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter, and the subtitle is Frank Ramsey, A Sheer Excess of Powers. And this is what Schumpeter said of him: "Certainly that young man was a true product of Cambridge at its best. Nobody can have any doubt about it who ever met him," which the present writer did but once. "In discussion, he impressed one curiously, like an overgrown 2-year-old who misbehaves on the race course, from sheer excess of powers." 2-year-old racehorse, that is. And certainly Ramsey did have a sheer excess of powers. He was a mathematics undergraduate at Cambridge from 1920 to 1923. He was very young when he started because he had already been spotted as being very, very clever as a schoolboy at Winchester. This is what G.E. Moore, the philosopher, said of Ramsey as an undergraduate. "In the early 20s, F.P. Ramsey attended at least one course of my lectures. I had soon come to feel of him, as of Wittgenstein, that he was very much cleverer than I was, and consequently I felt distinctly nervous in lecturing before him. I was afraid that he would see some gross absurdity in things which I said, of which I was quite unconscious." As an undergraduate, Ramsey wrote a paper commissioned by C.K. Ogden at the top of your screen and John Maynard Keynes at the bottom of your screen on the Douglas proposals. Now, even the economists in the Zoom room, may not have heard of the Douglas proposals. C.H. Douglas was an engineer and a social reformer on the left, and he came up with an idea called social credit, and thought that if the government paid a subsidy for producing goods, this would set the world aright. And the Labour Party at the time was thinking of adopting social credit as their policy. And Keynes really smelled a rat here. And Douglas's paper was full of mathematics. No one quite understood it. And Keynes asked the 19-year-old Ramsey to take a look at the Douglas proposals and write a paper giving his opinion. And Ramsey absolutely slaughtered the Douglas proposals. And as a result, those of anyone in political science and anyone who grew up in Alberta will remember the Socreds. So social credit was drummed out of the UK by Frank Ramsey, and instead C.K. Douglas took his kind of weirdly half left, half right, anti-Semitic, Christian, barking mad political theory to, of course, Alberta and Australia. But even as an undergraduate, he was already changing the economic world of the UK. Also, as an undergraduate, he completely destroyed Keynes's brand new treatise on probability. He wrote a paper called Mr. Keynes on Probability in 1922. And as Keynes's friend Clive Bell said, Ramsey made a rent in Keynes's theory of probability, which caused the stitches to run. And Keynes saw that he had been refuted by his favorite undergraduate and really abandoned his theory of probability as it stood then, just abandoned it. His undergraduate thesis was titled The Foundations of Mathematics. Remember, Ramsey was a mathematics student, although he spent no time at all on the mathematics. It was a sideshow to him, his brother said, and nonetheless, he graduated senior wrangler first in his class. And in his undergraduate thesis, he tried to repair a problem in Russell and Whitehead's Principia Mathematica, that's Russell there, and improve on Russell's theory of types. And he submitted it for the Smith's Prize, which was the prize for the best undergraduate thesis. And here we have Harold Jeffreys, the famous probability theorist and statistician, recalling that Ramsey didn't get the Smith's Prize.
It's sort of leaked round to me that they consulted somebody who said that it wasn't very good, said that his paper wasn't very good. And then Bertrand Russell afterwards consulted and said that his work was first rate, which made various people wonder who the hell was the expert they had consulted.
It's your first snippet from the past.
It's sort of leaked round.
Ramsey's undergraduate thesis, if it didn't win the Smith's Prize, it had a major impact on the Vienna Circle. You have March Schlick up on top and Rudolf Carnap at the bottom. The Circle talked about Ramsey's paper for 2 weeks in January 1927 and then intermittently right through to 1929. And they thought that Ramsey's paper was the turning point in philosophy. So it didn't really matter that it didn't win the Smith's Prize. Also, as an undergraduate, Ramsey translated Wittgenstein's very difficult manuscript that he wrote on the front in the First World War, fighting for the Austrians. Wittgenstein had declared that Russell didn't understand it, Moore didn't understand it, Frege didn't understand it, and he was very cross at the stupidity of all these great philosophers and logicians. They don't understand my ideas. And when Russell was tasked by Wittgenstein to find a translator and publish his manuscript in English, Russell lighted on his favorite undergraduate, Frank Ramsey, and asked Ramsey if he might translate it. And Ramsey, who had won the German prize at Winchester, but who much more importantly was just steeped in the kind of logic-y, mathematic-y philosophy that Wittgenstein was writing in, literally took Wittgenstein's typescript in German, went to Miss Pate's office in the university typing pool, and read in English to Miss Pate off of the German manuscript. And Miss Pate wrote it down in shorthand, typed it up, and there was a bit of to and fro between Ramsey, Wittgenstein, Ogden, and Wittgenstein declared the translation not only accurate, but where it differed from the German, the English translation was a better account of Wittgenstein's ideas. Ramsey then wrote a critical notice of it in 1923, which still stands as one of the most important commentaries of this hugely influential and difficult work. He was made a Don mathematics at the age of 21, King's College, Cambridge. And here's Richard Braithwaite, his friend, talking about how that happened.
Because then, of course, Keynes snapped him up before he got into it. Oh, sorry. Do you know the expression? Pounced.
Right.
Pounced. Keynes pounced. Or Keynes got Keynes to pounce. I hadn't realised Keynes' ability to get the college to agree to pouncing.
So that's Braithwaite saying that Ramsey should have been at Trinity College. That's where he was an undergraduate. Trinity is still peaked at this, that Keynes snapped him up. Keynes got Keynes to snap him up before Trinity could. He became a superstar in 4 disciplines at the very least. Kind of depends how you count your disciplines. Pure mathematics, economics, subjective probability, expected utility theory, and in philosophy. In pure mathematics, he founded a theory called Ramsey theory, which studies the conditions under which order must occur. It's a branch of very technical, either number theory or graph theory, and it's still one of the very fruitful branch of economics. You go to any mathematics, you go to any mathematics department, you'll find 1 or 2 Ramsey theorists. In economics, he published 2 papers in Keynes's Economic Journal. One was called A Mathematical Theory of Saving, the other a contribution to the theory of taxation. And when the Economic Journal celebrated its 125th anniversary, so one of the most important journals in the world, celebrates a century and a quarter of its greatest hits. The editors, and there were 14 of its greatest hits in this anniversary edition, and both Ramsey's papers were in it. And the editors had to explain, I'm sure, to those many, many people who thought, well, what about so-and-so? What about this paper? That they had to include both of Ramsey's papers because each of these papers really founded a new discipline or subdiscipline of economics, optimal savings theory and optimal taxation theory. He also founded subjective probability and expected utility theory. In 1926, a few years before Bruno Di Finetti in Italy, Ramsey figured out how to measure partial belief. He put forward a theory of probability as subjective degree of belief, and he showed that rationality could be understood as expected utility. And now, of course, utility theory is everywhere and pernicious almost everywhere, but Ramsey is not to blame. In fact, he would have hated what became of his idea in economics and in behavioral psychology, because Ramsey argued, and actually this is something that I'm really, really pleased to say that I discovered. I found minutes of meetings of societies, mathematical societies, in Cambridge in 1926 and 1927, as Ramsey's writing his 2 famous papers in economics, which rest on utility analyses. He's running around Cambridge arguing that this is a highly idealized structure that really shouldn't be employed in any real world circumstance. He argued that no real person can have a set of beliefs that are perfectly coherent in terms of the probability calculus. And he's only talking about a highly idealized system to which those of actual people, especially the speaker, in part approximate. So he's considered the founder of all of the Bayesian statistics that underlies so much, but he would have been wary. Ramsey was a socialist, like his friends Morris Daub and Piero Sraffa. In philosophy as well, many things are named after him. Ramsey sentences, the Ramsey test for conditionalization, and on and on and on. But my favorite is from Donald Davidson, who coined the term the Ramsey effect. And that's discovering that your exciting and apparently original philosophical discovery has been already presented and presented much more elegantly by Frank Ramsey when he was 26 years old. Any philosophers in the audience will know that Donald Davidson was one of the most important philosophers of the last generation. And for Davidson to say this was really something. Ramsey was one of a very few people who could counter Wittgenstein, who was a strong and not very nice personality. Here's...
Because whenever he felt that somebody was wrong, it was wrong. And therefore he'd say it. And that's why he'd stand, I would say, he'd stand up to God himself.
That's Wittgenstein's nephew talking about Ramsey standing up to God himself, i.e. to his uncle Ludwig. And here I think this is Ramsey's wife, widow at the time.
Because whenever he
Frank
felt
made
that
him
somebody...
cry
Because
sometimes. He, you know, Wittgenstein was a person who would go on and on and on and on and on. I think Frank found Wittgenstein very trying. I mean, he certainly, he was the person who would wear you down.
At the very beginning of that, Ramsey says, Frank made him cry sometimes. And Frank Ramsey made Wittgenstein cry in 1929 because Ramsey was the only person who really could counter Wittgenstein, argue against his position. And one of my arguments in this biography of Ramsey, but also in a previous book, was that Ramsey really was responsible for getting Wittgenstein to see that his position in the Tractatus was no good at all, and turned Wittgenstein into what we now think of as the later Wittgenstein. Although Ramsey wouldn't have liked what his friend, where his friend wandered off.
Frank made him cry.
So let's just take a look at Wittgenstein's Tractatus and see what Ramsey thought was wrong with it. In the Tractatus, Wittgenstein gives us what is called the picture theory of meaning and truth. Meaningful propositions can be broken down into their simple elements. And if those elements correspond to simple objects in the world, then the proposition is true. So the picture, Wittgenstein says, agrees with reality, objective reality or not. And Wittgenstein argued that we can only express what's in that simple objective language. And he ends the Tractatus with the famous line, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. A whole bunch of things that we can't speak about in this objective language. We can't speak about value. We can't speak about causal connections, about religion. We can only show or gesture at these things unless they're complete nonsense, like philosophy. We can't even gesture at philosophy. We just have to dump it in the bin in the rubbish bin. So Ramsey persuaded Wittgenstein to drop this quest for certainty and objectivity and purity and turn to ordinary languages and human practices. Ramsey was in search of what he called a realistic philosophy, and he was leaning in the direction of American pragmatism when he died. Actually, from very early on, from his undergraduate days, he had these kind of pragmatist tendencies, shall we say. And here's Ramsey in 1929, really delivering one of his many hammer blows to Wittgenstein, and no doubt it was this kind of thing that made Wittgenstein cry. Ramsey said, we cannot really picture the world as disconnected selves. The selves we know are in the world. What we can't do, and it's no good trying. Sure, that's right, what Wittgenstein says. But philosophy comes from not understanding the logic of our language, but the logic of our language is not what Wittgenstein thought. The pictures we make to ourselves are not pictures of facts. So Ramsey was looking for, for a more human, subjective account of truth and meaning and knowledge. We'll get to that right at the end of this talk. All this, and he died at the age of 26, I think from leptospirosis or Weil's disease caused by bacteria carried by the urine of animals and often found in the River Cam. Ramsey loved swimming in the River Cam. When this hypothesis was first floated by one of the really impressive medical folks who was trying to help me figure out how he died, David Naylor said, well, it makes good sense, but you know, the incubation of these bacteria is such and such, and it means you have be swimming in the Cam at the end of October. Is that really likely? And now you can Google weather, Cambridge, October 1929. Headline news, it was really unusually warm, and so Ramsey probably was swimming in the Cam that October. Here's Lytton Strachey writing to Dady Rylands, to folks right at the center of Bloomsbury. Strachey says, after Ramsey died, "The loss to your generation is agonizing to think of, and the world will never know what has happened, what a light has gone out. I always thought there was something of Newton about him, the ease and majesty of the thought, the gentleness of the temperament." Now you might ask, how can any one person who isn't Ramsey himself possibly write an intellectual biography of Ramsey? And the way I've solved this problem, because it really is, if you aren't Ramsey, you can't write about all of his ideas. So I had guest boxes demarcated by by borders. I had the economist Sir Partha Dasgupta write on Ramsey's economics. I had Hugh Price, Simon Blackburn, Michael Potter on topics in philosophy and the foundations of mathematics. And I had the great Ramsey theorist Ron Graham write on Ramsey theory. And unfortunately, Ron Graham died about 1.5 years ago. And in his guest box, he made this offer. Any mathematicians in the audience, if you can prove or disprove that, then because Ron Graham has died, I owe you $1,000. So write it down quickly. And actually, someone just last night told me that my Erdos number is 2. An Erdos number is the distance you have away from the great number theorist Paul Erdos. So if you co-authored with Erdos, as did Ron Graham 29 times, your Erdos number is 1. But because I kind of co-authored with Ron Graham, this mathematics student last night said that my Erdos number is 2, which is pretty good for a mere jobbing philosopher. Ramsey also had a really excellent and interesting personal life. Here's Frances Partridge before she married Rafe Partridge. Her name was Marshall, so that's how she's known in my biography. Right at the center of that Bloomsbury, that core Bloomsbury triangle, Lytton Strachey, I guess it's not a triangle, Lytton Strachey, Dora Carrington, Rafe Partridge, and Frances Marshall. Here's what Frances Partridge had to say about Ramsey.
He was a simple character in many ways, Frank. He enjoyed simple things. He had a tremendous sense of humor. He used to have an enormous laugh. His whole mouth, his whole face cracked when he laughed.
He was married to Lettice Copley Baker, known afterwards as Lettice Ramsey. She was a renowned portrait photographer and adventurer. A lot of the familiar portraits of the Bloomsbury circle were taken by Lettice. And here's what Lettice had to say about Frank.
Is that he was very good at using his great brain to pick out the essential, well, what was important in any situation. I'm not talking now about maths or philosophy or anything, but any ordinary situation. I mean, he would be very good at picking out what, in any human situation, what was the thing that was important. Is that
his life was absolutely gripping. He lived in really interesting times. He came up to Cambridge 1 year after the Great War. And because he had been a very precocious child, he was 3 years younger when he graduated from Winchester, 3 years younger than his classmates, which caused him problems. Everyone else was much more mature and older. And because Ramsey was such a big guy, people didn't really clock that he was so much younger. So he comes up to Cambridge 1 year after the Great War, and now he's not 3 years younger than his classmates, but he's 6, 7, 8 years younger because he's coming back with all these returning veterans. And so the age gap between Ramsey and his peers is really significant. As a result of the problems, mostly to do with anxiety about sex, he was part of the Great English Migration to Vienna for psychoanalysis in the early 1920s. He was analyzed by one of Freud's students, Theodor Reich, who's quite well known. And as you've seen, he was part of Bloomsbury and the Apostles. These were some of his friends. Kingsley Martin in the center up top, who was the future editor of The New Statesman, and that's Martin's sister, Irene Martin Barclay, and she was Britain's first female chartered surveyor and an advocate for improved housing conditions for the poor. And down below, you have Paul Redmayne of the Cadbury family. They're on holiday in Vienna, and that's Ramsey at the bottom. His family was also absolutely fascinating. His mother was a social reformer, did a huge amount for women's rights, for the poor, died in a car accident because his father, who was a kind of jobbing mathematician at Cambridge, was an absent-minded and reckless driver and turned over the family car and killing Agnes. One of his sisters was an economics don, the little one on the mother's lap there, and the other a physician. And at the side there, you have his brother, Michael Ramsey, Archbishop of Canterbury. So his family was also very interesting. Being part of Bloomsbury, Ramsey and Lettuce had an open marriage. Actually, Lettuce insisted on it. Ramsey was perfectly happy with it. And they disagreed about what an open marriage amounted to. Lettuce thought that an open marriage was great because they could each sleep with many, many, many people, which Lettuce did. There are rumors of Lettuce in her, deep into her 80s in Cambridge, still being very active. And Frank's idea of an open marriage was not, oh, great, we can sleep with many tens and tens of people, but rather, oh, good, I can have another great love in my life. And that great love was Elizabeth Denbigh, who was a very influential housing reformer for the poor, one of Britain's first female architects, and actually has a little biography of her own. Other friends, Sri Zimo, very well-known Chinese poet who spent a couple of years in Cambridge. That's Pat Blackett in the middle, Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and Lionel Penrose at the end, really the founder of British genetics, and Roger Penrose's father. And here is, I think, one of the Penrose brothers.
So one of the first times I met him at Cambridge was when they were giving a party. I remember they were mixing some curious drink with pure alcohol.
Yes, that's Lionel Penrose's brother. So clearly they had a very active social life, giving parties with pure alcohol.
So one of the
again, very, very much part of Bloomsbury. That's Virginia Woolf, who met Ramsey a few times and was suitably impressed by him. Up here at the top, we have Dora Carrington, Lytton Strachey at the outside of the picture. And sitting on the ground, we have Sebastian Sprott, who was a flamboyantly gay man when Ramsey knew him in Cambridge as undergraduates. And Sprott went off to the University of Nottingham and became a very, very well-known sociologist. And can't remember who's below there, but he's also part of Bloomsbury. And the last word, I think, should be Ramsey's, or the last many words. I'm going to speak a little about an untitled paper Ramsey read to the Apostles in 1925. It's really a paper about the meaning of life. It was a response to Wittgenstein, who had scorned the Apostles as having nothing to discuss. And he quit in a fit of pique that this elite discussion group had nothing to discuss. and who thought that everything outside, and Wittgenstein thought that everything outside the primary language of logic and direct experience was undiscussable anyway. So he really hated these discussion groups where they talked about feelings and sexual mores and politics. All of that Wittgenstein thought was not stuff you could discuss. It was also about the meaning of life, because Wittgenstein, of course, said you can't talk about the meaning of life. But Wittgenstein said, you can't talk about the meaning of life, but it's depressing. He was a very gloomy sort. It's also a bit of a response, this paper, to Russell, who said that you can talk about the meaning of life and it's depressing. So here was Russell, and this is from a talk that Russell himself gave to the apostles a few months before Ramsey's talk. And Ramsey definitely had this in mind when he gave his 1925 talk. So Russell says this kind of thing in a number of places. All the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system. The whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. So Ramsey's responding to Wittgenstein, who said, you can't talk about the meaning of life, but it's depressing. Russell said, you can talk about the meaning of life, and it's depressing because the universe is going to end, and we're just these tiny specks on it anyway, and somehow we have to plod along. So here's Ramsey. Where I seem to differ from some of my friends, i.e. Russell and Wittgenstein, is in attaching little importance to physical size. I don't feel the least humble before the vastness of the heavens. The stars may be large, but they cannot think or love. And these are qualities which impress me far more than size does. I take no credit for weighing nearly 17 stone. My picture of the world is drawn in perspective and not like a model to scale. The foreground is occupied by human beings, and the stars are all as small as threepenny bits. I apply my perspective not merely to space, but also to time. In time, the world will cool and everything will die. Now we think it'll heat up and everything will die. But that is a long time off still, and its present value at compound discount is almost nothing. Nor is the present less valuable because the future will be blank. Humanity, which fills the foreground of my picture, I find interesting and on the whole admirable. I find, just now at least, the world a pleasant and exciting place. You may find it depressing. I am sorry for you, and you despise me. But I have reason, and you have none. I pity you with reason because it is pleasanter to be thrilled than to be depressed, and not merely pleasanter, but better for all one's activities. His argument is this: those philosophers who focus on the vastness and unknowability of the world are on the wrong track about the meaning of life. And notice that there are two ways to focus on the unknowability of the meaning of the world. There's Russell's way: the universe is so vast and we're, little specks in it. And there's Wittgenstein's way: all we can know is, really direct experience. We can know, like, this pen is orange or has orange bits. Anything of any interest goes beyond that elementary picture where our words latch onto objects in the world, and hence we can't even speak about it, never mind know anything about it. So there are two ways of focusing on, if you like, objectivity, and these are not good approaches, both to the meaning of life, but to philosophy more generally. Ramsey's argument is that what we are interested in is the world of human beings and making things better for them, for us. So we can discuss or assess our feelings about the meaning of life and ethics in these terms, in terms of their impacts on human life and behavior. And generally, this was Ramsey's approach in philosophy and economics as well. What we're searching for is a realistic account of knowledge, truth, probability, i.e., accounts of these concepts that are really connected to our practices, to human practice and human life. And that's why I've argued that Ramsey was a pragmatist. He described himself as a pragmatist as well. But he was interested in what he sometimes called the subjective side, as well as in facts and mathematics and calculations. And it's a highly unusual combination to find someone who was that brilliant an economist, that brilliant a mathematician, also interested in human questions and really requiring that philosophy and economics be about human inquiry rather than some kind of correspondence between our beliefs and the objective world. Even in mathematics, right at the very end of his life, he started to toy, maybe toy is too weak a word, toy with intuitionist mathematics, which says that mathematics, the truths of mathematics are what human beings can prove. And I say that toy is too weak a word because he actually wrote out on some scraps of paper a fair bit of intuitionist mathematics. Okay, this is how it would go. So he was very interested in intuition right towards the end of his life. Okay, I will stop there and take questions.
Thank you very